Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the last of Safer London's summer webinar series. For those of you that are not familiar with Zoom, you will see that there is a Q&A facility at the bottom of the page. If you hover your cursor down, we will be taking questions throughout today's webinar, probably collecting them all at the end and answering some of the questions then. I'd like to thank you all for giving up some time, and I hope you find this interesting. They are being recorded and being shared on our website at a later date. I'm absolutely thrilled that we've got some of Safer London's practitioners here talking about their work. We've got Dr. Carleen Furman from the University of Bedfordshire talking about contextual safeguarding, and Carly Adams-Elias, one of our organisational leads. Safer London is really keen that we embrace new ways of working, and we are particularly keen to ensure that as we roll out our new strategy, details of which are on our website, we can begin to take referrals around a place as well as around young people. And you're going to hear a whole host more about that as we work through today's webinar. I think it's probably fair to say that at Safer London we haven't done enough work around young people's voices and young Londoners shaping what we do, and we've made a real commitment in our strategy and our work going forward that we will do a lot more of that. And so we've kicked off each of these webinars with input from young people. Today is slightly different in that I actually saw this video that you're about to see on the internet, and I was so impressed with it that I actually looked made contact with the young man who made the video and asked him if I could share it today. It's very short, but it's very powerful, and I'm going to ask my colleague Helen now to share it with you all.
Welcome to the EE voicemail. I'm sorry, but the person you've called is not available. Please leave your message after the tone.
Yo, I just thought I'd give you a message. Just wanted to let you know how I'm doing. Yeah, I can't lie, man. I'm getting sick of the ends. I feel trapped. Everyone's on the same shit. Everyone's bad, but no one's really trying to grow. No one really cares about me. I prayed it. People just want to use me because I'm useful. But also, yeah, I feel like I'm alone in my own head. I've got my own problems, insecurities, and fears. I also got plans, big dreams and visions. I just want to make my parents proud, man. You know what? That's hard in the sea. Yeah, I got a clean heart, but being in such a mad area, I don't know, I feel like I could move the wrong way. Do you get what I mean? So I can't do this, I've got to get out of the ends. I want to be better. No way am I going to be a product of my environment. Inshallah, man, I'm praying for better days. But you know what? Man's waffling. I'm going to get back to you and give you an update. Love.
The young man that made that video is also following up with a very small piece to camera about what inspired him to make that video, and you'll be able to see that on Safer London's website shortly. But I hope most of you found that as powerful as I did. For me, one of the most powerful things about that was that it was completely unprompted, that the young man that made the video decided to make it entirely off of his own back. I mean, I think the skills that he showed in such a high production piece was one thing, but actually the message he sent was a real pure message from young people in London. So often we use young people to either endorse or maybe even sometimes challenge the work that we're doing. But here, this young man absolutely made the decision that that is what he wanted to say in that video. I think it talks and leads us in quite nicely to this conversation around the impact that place can have on children and young people. And to that end, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Carleen Furman, MBE from the University of Bedfordshire, and she will be in dialogue with Carly Adams-Elias from Safer London. So over to you, Carly and Carleen.
Thank you, Sherry. I just want to start by saying it's an absolute pleasure and a privilege to speak to you today, Carleen, as the person that coined the term contextual safeguarding and has obviously led on the development of contextual safeguarding as a framework to help practitioners think about how we can apply contextual safeguarding in our practice. So I'll hand over to you to tell us a bit more about your work and kind of the role at the university.
Hi, thanks, Carly. It's really great to be here with you all. So, as I said, I head up the Contextual Safeguarding programme at the University of Bedfordshire, and my role there is to oversee the research programme that's tracking the development of contextual safeguarding as an approach to support responses to harm that occurs outside of the family home. So we support local areas and document their efforts and then translate those efforts into resources that we share on our network for other practitioners to take up and utilise. And we host an online practice network of 8,000 practitioners who are using our resources to develop contextual safeguarding in their own practice and teams.
That's great, thank you, Carleen. Thinking for those that are not familiar with contextual safeguarding as a framework, can you briefly explain what it is and why we might need to reassess or indeed reform our approach to safeguarding young people?
Sure. So contextual safeguarding is an approach to responding to risks and harm that occurs outside of the family home. And it was introduced because over the past decade, there's been increasing concern about the welfare of young people and the harm that they experience in public places, in school environments, and in their friendship groups, like sexual exploitation, increasingly other forms of criminal exploitation, and the abuse they experience in their own intimate relationships, for example. Increasing concern about these harms has also been surrounded by a message that these are all forms of abuse and that children should be protected from them. And as a result, child protection systems have been required to respond to these forms of harm. But as that has happened, we've realised that there is a pretty ill fit between traditional approaches to safeguard children from abuse and abuse that occurs in contexts beyond the family home. So contextual safeguarding was really designed to try to resolve some of those tensions and particularly think about how traditional safeguarding and specifically child protection practices could be better aligned to assess and respond to contexts and relationships that went beyond families.
Thank you, that's really helpful. So thinking more specifically about public places as a context within which young people might experience harm, can you tell us about what a contextual safeguarding approach to building safety in public places might look like?
Sure. So I'll give you an example at two levels. Firstly, contextual safeguarding as an approach instead of a model is organised over four kind of, we'd call them domains or features. So if we go into a service or into a team or looking at a case or looking at an entire system, we'd be asking, does this example target the context in which that abuse has happened or the social conditions that facilitated that abuse? That's domain one. Then we ask, does this system or response or practice attend to those issues through the lens of child welfare or child protection? That's domain two. Then we look at the partnerships in place and ask whether or not the people who have a reach into or responsibility for that place are part of the response and solution offered. That's domain three. And then we look at how success is being measured and whether it's being measured contextually. So do we know that the contexts identified in that instance or by that system have become safer as a result of the response? So that is generally contextual safeguarding, targeting the social conditions of abuse through the lens of child welfare with the appropriate partnerships in place and measuring your impact contextually. And you can apply that to an entire system or to an individual case. When that applies to safety in public spaces, what we're looking at is, are the public places where exploitation, for example, where exploitation occurs, are those public spaces the target of our assessment and response, and not just the children who are exploited in those places? We then ask, and this is sometimes the most critical piece for public spaces, is the response offered delivered through a lens of child welfare, or is it primarily driven through a lens of community safety and crime prevention? These are not the same things. And historically, public space harm has been managed through a community safety type portfolio and wouldn't necessarily be monitoring the level of child welfare or the experiences of children and young people as the driving force behind the response. Then we'd look at, okay, in response to that locality, that child welfare led response, are the partners required are they involved? So if it's on a high street, have the local businesses been engaged in the assessment and intervention plan? Have rubbish collectors been involved in that process? Transport providers, if it's a transport thoroughfare, local schools, if children spend time on that high street on the way to or from education, for example. So who are the partners, and critically young people and parents as partners in that? And then what's our measure at the start? Why are we even concerned about this high street? And then how would we know it's safer? How are we measuring its safety? And that is kind of what a contextual safeguarding response would look like to a public place. Safety, or kind of success, I should say, couldn't solely be measured through a reduction in antisocial behaviour reports, for example, or reduction in reports of crime. What we'd want to see is increased reports of young people feeling safe and feeling included in that type of space, and collaboration, evidence of community guardianship and adults and young people having positive relationships with each other, a positive use of the space, and a sense that space has become hostile to exploitation but inclusive of young people. And all too often we see responses to public spaces that are hostile to young people and not actually hostile to abuse. And in fact, if we have places that are hostile to young people and view them as antisocial, they can be very conducive with abuse, because it's much easier to approach and harm children if no one views them as vulnerable.
That's so helpful. Thank you, Carleen. Can you help us understand a bit about some of the policy and practice implications for sustaining such an approach?
Yeah, so one of the kind of practice implications that we've seen, and this links to policy really, is what are the frameworks, the practice frameworks we use to organise that type of response. Most of our assessments that we use, our assessment frameworks and assessment tools, are organised around the assessment of individual children and or their families. So organisations need to create assessment frameworks to hold and organise the information that they have about a locality and to track any changes that are occurring there. Obviously, a number of the assessment methods feel like common sense, going and speaking to people, getting a sense of the space, observing it, feeling out what's going on, engaging with young people. Then there's a step to organise all of that, so you can bring a partnership around that information and everybody be focused on a shared objective. So we've been piloting things like location assessment frameworks, where people come together to discuss the needs of the young people or wider population who utilise that space, the level of guardianship capacity in that space. And by guardianship, we mean protective adults, where there are trusted relationships between young people and adults, and those adults have a caring investment in those young people. We don't mean increased surveillance of young people in public spaces, and there's quite a difference there. And then we would look at the environmental factors in the locality, poverty, exposure to crime, or even just the use of the space, positive use of the space, disused spaces, and so on and so forth. So the partnership would come to discuss that, rather than sit down to discuss individual children who are in that space, or solely focus on rates of crime in that space. And that brings everybody around the table with a shared language about how we build safety. So there are policy implications for developing frameworks for assessing and planning for public spaces through the lens of child welfare. And there are likely other, and we've seen them emerging in test sites, questions about information sharing agreements, what we're expecting of partner organisations when we respond in this way, and what is the responsibility of a private business that operates on a high street to participate in a plan that builds safety for children and young people who spend time on that high street. Some of this is being worked through as we speak, and we're working on an updated legal briefing, for example, to support practice in this area. But our test work in local areas is where we think we're going to see some of the most interesting results, and how we progress from interventions that are based largely on relationships, so I know you, so I'll give it a go, through to something that's going to be consistent. So even if I leave that organisation tomorrow, the partnership with that shop on the high street still exists and isn't reliant on me being in post to work. And at the moment, a lot of the contextual practice we see is based on people knowing each other and isn't necessarily integrated into the system. The other thing you also need, and I'm sure you're going to be talking about it over the course of today, is a system that can hold all that information, can hold your successes and your challenges and record them like you would for outcomes for individual children and young people, and a referral pathway, an ICT system that can accept referrals for locations and record successes, so that once again what has happened before in that location isn't solely held in the head of one practitioner who may move on from that organisation, but there is a legacy, so people know we tried that before, that was really helpful, this has happened before, this person's a key partner to work within that location. So all of this will take ongoing development and will be done best if it occurs in collaboration with young people and their wider communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things I'm really interested in is thinking about the different roles that different agencies have, because obviously the partnership element is a really important part of the framework. And obviously at Safer London, we're thinking about how we can kind of introduce, you know, the referral pathways and the structures, but actually how does that interlink and work alongside, say, for example, local authorities, and are they in a position where they're, you know, undertaking a safeguarding assessment about a place, and kind of, yeah, I think there's obviously work to do, but I'm just interested to hear what you think the different roles could or should be doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment, most of the organising is happening in local authorities around the testing of contextual safeguarding. So they tend to be coordinating the assessments and chairing the multi-agency meetings where locations are being discussed. But the task of then intervening or providing support into those locations tends to be quite diffuse and is determined by the location or the context itself, and who is an existing partner and where the needs are. So partners have included people that organise activities for young people, library staff, people that work in parks, shopping centres. All sorts of people have been involved in the delivery of plans that align to assessments that have been conducted on locations. But I think over time there will obviously be further conversations about how this how the relationship between things like that happening in voluntary sector organisations relates to social care, probably in the same way that's happened with children and young people. So children and young people will be assessed by social workers when they're being supported by children's social care, but then they'll also receive additional assessments or supplementary assessments, or their first assessments when they're being supported by a voluntary sector agency. So I think there'll definitely need to be further conversation about connecting those things and thinking about avoiding duplication in all of those efforts.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really interested to see how things are progressing with the test sites. And I know that we're still kind of fairly early on in the development of contextual safeguarding, but I know lots of people are very eager to kind of pick it up and take it on. So but I guess every time you do, there's more questions and more things to consider. But it's really helpful to have this opportunity to speak to you now. I'm going to hand over to back over to Sherry. And I hope that you're going to stay with us for some more questions. Yep. Thank you.
Thanks.
Fabulous. Thank you, Carleen and Carly. I'm actually going to completely go off script now and refer to some of the questions, because I think they are wholly and solely about what we've just been discussing. So I don't know if Carly and Carleen, you're happy to put your video and camera and what have you on again. And I'm really sorry, Helen, if that means that I've done something with the technical stuff, but it just sort of makes sense to answer some of these questions now, and then we'll move on to our colleague Rudy. My observation was, I think you talked about, Carleen, being able to refer or being able to receive referrals around the place, and how we would perhaps answer how some of that's happening. And I think I'm very pleased to see that what Carly responded was that we're not actually sure we've got all the answers yet. We're beginning to explore it. And some of the questions sort of relate to some of this. So one of the first questions is you made reference to all sorts of organisations there around how broad the partnership in places could and should be. And I guess from what I'm hearing from what you've said, it can't be too broad. There's almost no one that can't be involved. But have you got an observation on that, perhaps? Have you got any thoughts about that? Is there people that should or shouldn't be involved?
I don't think there's anyone that shouldn't, but I do think that it is informed by context in question. So if the context in question is a park, then the people that definitely need to be involved are the people that manage the park or have reach into the park. So park gardeners, park wardens, landscapers, the local council, waste management, young people, neighbouring schools, they would feature. You wouldn't invite the housing association if they have no kind of reach into responsibility for ability to make a difference in the park. And likewise in the high street, if you were focused on the high street, you wouldn't necessarily invite people who would be responsible for the park. So it is very much determined by the needs of that context. And that's why I guess one of the key things that we've seen being really important in contextual safeguarding is the process of assessment. This isn't about people saying, oh, we've identified an issue in the park, and then immediately tasking a response into the park. If we have an emerging concern about the park, the next thing that happens is an assessment of the needs of the park itself. What are the current levels of guardianship? Who are the adults that are there? Do they have any confidence in what to do? Do they have a good relationship with young people? How do young people feel about the park? Why do they go there? So a thorough assessment needs to happen first, and that assessment would then inform who's the partnership that's then involved in this, who needs to sit down and agree the plan, rather than saying these are the people that are always involved. But the assessment is very important, and an assessment focuses the mind on the welfare of children in the locality, and that's really what it's designed to do.
Thank you. And then one of the other questions that I'm going to ask you to make reference to is people are interested in how many test sites are in place at the moment.
So there are 10 formal test local authorities in England and Wales, and then there are another 32 local authorities in England and Wales who are developing the approach removed from the research team, but are reporting back to the research team via a kind of interest network, and there's one developing now in Scotland.
Okay, and people can go to your website to find out where they are and who they could contact, is that right?
Yeah. Everything's reported on the Contextual Safeguarding Network, and as our learning kind of is solidified in test sites, we publish all the resources and case studies developing in test sites on the Contextual Safeguarding Network, and they are free to access to anybody that joins the network, and that is also free to do.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. There are some other questions there, but I'm conscious that Helen will, if she was sitting next to me, would be giving me daggers right now around time, and they are quite specific questions. The commitment I can make to people on the webinar is we will answer all the questions, even if we just put the answer up on our website. So Carleen and Carly, thank you very much. And I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Rudy James. Rudy is the manager of our front door and has been the person that's been tasked with grappling with not only bringing all of our referral systems together, because referrals used to come into different places into Safer London, and we wanted to make sure it was really safe and bring them into one place, but also to begin to get his head around this, taking a referral around a place, how we record that, what the assessment looks like. And Rudy's going to talk to us a little bit about that one front door approach and beginning to think about how we might take referrals around a place. So I'm going to hand over to you, Rudy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sherry and Carly and Colin. I'm going to talk briefly about our one front door service. But it was quite interesting to hear what Carlin was talking about how we receive referrals or inquiries about places, and especially around the environment, which is especially happening now in this current climate. But I'm just going to talk about Safer London's one front door. It's really new and it's exciting at this present moment, and I think it will continue to be exciting, about how you make referrals to Safer London around people's peers and places. And the referrals are looking at how do we work with young individuals, especially young Londoners, who are addressing violence, especially serious youth violence, and also exploitation. So part of the role of what the team does and how I manage the team is to have a one-stop kind of access, and that's why the front door is, for referrers, for young Londoners, and especially for the community, about how they could get information about supporting young Londoners, and especially supporting, as we talked about partnership, supporting their organisations. We talk about the front door. It's really a really good front door. It hasn't got a doorbell, I'm going to be honest with you, but what we have a system where you could talk to the team around the front door. We could do that via email, via our telephone service, and especially around the website. If you go on our website, it gives you access into our service and how you can actually make referrals. Part of the referral process, what Carly was talking about, a pathway, we like to introduce a clear pathway and something which is, I'm going to say, user-friendly to all aspects. So we have professionals who would use a referral for referring a young Londoner into the service, who may be looking at an intervention around exploitation, or looking around something which is around violence, and what kind of support is there available, what intervention is there available. And coming through the front door, our team, and I will say just quickly about the team is very experienced in delivering information, support and guidance to anyone who really wants some information about the subject we're talking about. And we're going to talk a bit more about places as we move on. But the referral pathway is a smooth transition to supporting young Londoners to gain an intervention and to actually support them and also support the referrer and the community. I'll just give you an example. So the way it works on a day-to-day basis, somebody or referrer will contact us and just say via email and have an inquiry about a young Londoner. And we will respond back to that email. And it could be an inquiry, they wanted a direction of support where they may be signposted, or they want to actually make a referral into Safer London for an intervention. And the front door service can actually support you all the way through that process. And we could support young Londoners as well. If a young Londoner was in a situation where they wanted support or wanted some guidance around something which is happening to them, which fits the criteria, we could support them through actually filling in the referral form or giving support and guidance. Part of the team work is actually to support each individual and everyone coming through the referral. As was mentioned earlier on around contextual safeguarding, we don't take referrals for contextual safeguarding, but we do work with the local authority around the issues around that. And this work has been working quite well for the, since I've been here for many moons, I should say. It's been working quite well. And at this present moment, we are looking at how we could build up relationships with other partners. And I'll give you an example about how that is working, especially around referrals, around places. Currently had a referral, I would say an inquiry from a housing association who identified that they had, I'm going to say, a square where it belonged to the housing association, and there were issues happening in that square. They've done an assessment, and it's quite good what Carlin was saying. When the assessment was completed, or is still ongoing, they realized that they needed some other involvement from partners. So they contacted Safer London and contacted myself about how to make a referral and also look at guidance. It was really around support and guidance, how they could look at how they could support the young Londoners who were using that space, whether it was appropriately or inappropriately, but how we as Safer London could offer something to the housing association to support that. So a referral is going to be made to us around places, and it was quite unique that they reached out and said that this is what they found. They've done previous work with us on one-to-one with, I want to say, one of their users of their service, and they said, well, that intervention was good for what was needed, but on this occasion, we're looking not for the young person, but for a place, and it was a place which was happening. So that's just an example of how the referral pathway is moving and how we are trying to and working realistically to make the referral pathway, I'm going to say easier, but more assisting young Londoners to get something from it. And especially our partners, and some partners who are coming on board now are talking about how do we make referrals. And the referrals, as I said, to us is quite easy. You can make a referral through the website, inquiry, and I'm sure that we'll put a link on our webinar later on today or in a few minutes about how to make a referral. And referrals are for young Londoners wanting an intervention, and it's through violence, exploitation, and also for places, peers, and people. I'm just going to hand you over to Claire, who will talk more about how the places actually work. And Claire, I would hand you over, who's our prevention and advocate manager.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you, Rudy. As mentioned, my name's Claire. So I work with places and spaces within Safer London. So still a relatively new role. I started mid last year. And I think that one thing that I notice is both internal to Safer London and also externally is that often the question that I get is, so what do you actually do? And so I think, you know, through conversations, particularly in those first beginning stages with my colleagues is, you know, having a conversation with them about the one-to-one work that they do with either young Londoners or with families, and really, I suppose, unpacking how I might complement that work. And so through those conversations, jumping into different meetings with different teams, we started creating this dialogue, which was quite interesting. And some of the locations that we started talking about were places like churches where there'd been an instance of peer-on-peer abuse. There'd also been a location around grooming that had occurred at a college. Also thinking about targeting schools where perhaps they're not responding in the way that we would like to instances of exploitation. Also addressing hotspot locations, so having those conversations around fast food restaurants, parks, high streets as well. There was also a conversation I'd had with one colleague around a local leisure centre, and so actually the physical design of that building, there were lots of kind of nooks and crannies and hidey spaces that weren't really being surveilled or weren't being supervised, I guess. And so what was happening as a result is sexual activity, but also peer-on-peer abuse. So the design of that building was facilitating these instances of of exploitation and harm for our young Londoners. And there was also a live music venue as well. So, you know, these kind of beginning conversations that I was having with my colleagues and with people external as well, I suppose give you a little bit of an idea about what kinds of spaces and places we might work with. And before lockdown, and I suppose before the world kind of came to a grinding halt, we were really starting to begin to target some of these contexts or locations of harm and beginning to look at the assessment and intervention process as well. So some of these contexts were schools, some takeaway restaurants, some were local business improvement districts. So that's where they were kind of a business collective on a high street. But another space that I'd like to talk about today was a local authority parks and cemeteries team. And so I got introduced to that team through the community safety lead of that local authority. And I got to meet with the team, and also there was an estate auditing lead there as well. And so in that meeting process, I saw this really as an opportunity for me to listen and to start to begin to develop an understanding of that context, because I wasn't from that local authority. I'm also from Australia. So, you know, there's things that I won't necessarily have an expertise on. I really want to have those conversations with people who understand that context much better than I would. And so I was having this conversation with them around what they saw and I suppose the concerns that they had as well. And what was quite interesting for me is through that initial meeting where here were a group of people who understood the context of harm and had a significant intelligence about this location of concern. So one person had kind of highlighted that there was a house that they would see when they were going through one of their local parks, and they would see young Londoners come in and out consistently wearing different uniforms. And this is during school hours as well. And so, you know, they had this information or this intelligence and they just didn't know what to do with it. And so here I had a room full of people who saw things that greatly concerned them, but who were unsure and perhaps felt disempowered about how they could respond. And I guess when I started to explore the opportunity to address some of their concerns, they were the ones who began providing potential solutions. And that was kind of the exciting thing, is I don't want to come into this space as the expert, because I want to facilitate this as a collaborative space. And similar to what Carleen was mentioning, you know, that we need to ensure that what we deliver and what we create is sustainable, because I'm not interested in coming in, delivering a training and then leaving, and then what happens afterwards. I want to make sure that, I suppose it's a community-led approach, but also that it can last and create a legacy as well that will exist long past when I exist, I guess. So what was exciting about that meeting is, you know, they started providing solutions to me about how they might be able to participate, how they could develop a whole team approach for the 40+ staff that were in their service. And that was really exciting to me. And so after that meeting, I went away and I developed a proposal about the different types of ways that we could do collaborative working and what this might look like. And I guess the important thing to highlight as well is that when we're creating or thinking about intervention, is that there's not one cookie cutter way of what intervention should look like. If we're doing it well, then we need to understand the unique context of that location and then respond to that need as a result. And so part of this proposal, one of the obvious things was training. So providing training to the staff on grooming, child exploitation, contextual safeguarding, but also looking at developing multi-agency partnerships. So sharing that intelligence that they'd kind of highlighted to me with exploitations and other local authority services, but also flagging with high schools as well. So building that bridge. So if they're seeing lots of young people who are perhaps going to these houses or hanging around at the parks during school hours, where can they go with that information, and how can they perhaps have a collaborative response to what they're seeing? internal policy development as well, creating exploitation resources for the team. So once we've come in and delivered training, where is that kind of refresher information that they can always draw on if they need to, if they're thinking about, well, what were the signs of grooming again? That's great, I've got that there that I can reference. And also engaging the wider communities through the Parks and Friends program that they have as well. So kind of similar to what Carleen was saying, you know, thinking about those guardianship, and I suppose who are the adults in that space who have that caring investment for those young people, and how can we build those relationships? So it wasn't just about coming in and moving young people on, but it was also about how do we kind of create those positive and inclusive spaces for young people as part of, and acknowledging that they are citizens who can contribute to the beauty of our society, I guess. Another thing that we were also looking at was doing pop-up safety mapping as well. So actually going into those locations and having conversations with our young Londoners and starting to develop an understanding about where do they feel unsafe and why do they feel unsafe, and ensuring that that's actually what informs the redevelopment of that physical space if that's what we decide is needed to be done. And that can also be part of our evaluation process. So coming back into that space and saying, how did we do? What other work needs to be done so that you can feel safe in this space? And another interesting thing, because we did have the estate auditing lead there as well, was that through conversations with this person, they'd actually made a suggestion that, so they have an auditing template that they would typically use for the locations that they go into. And they had actually made the suggestion that perhaps we need to have a safeguarding risk for our young Londoners. And that was really exciting to me because I don't understand well their job. I don't know what that looks like, but through facilitating these conversations and bringing a different lens into the way they think about their work, that those people actually can create really interesting and responsive interventions. So yeah, so that was kind of, I suppose, where that work was starting, and I was really excited about that, and I'm hoping that it kind of picks up as well. But I guess coming back to why can't we refer a place, it makes me think about, you know, what are the other cultural shifts that we've seen in prevention thinking? And I suppose one of the major ones that I could think about was seatbelts. So in Australia and over and here in the UK as well, you know, we introduced seatbelts because it wasn't enough for us to solely rely on emergency response services to intervene after incidences occurred, because we were too late. And so if we want to think about a cultural shift in the way that we start to address child exploitation, then we need to realize that it's not enough for us just to work with individual children, to move them around, or to work with families. We have to work with the young Londoners in mind who aren't yet known to the system, who haven't been flagged, who fall through the gaps, and who move through these spaces and are continuously harmed when we don't target the contexts that endanger them. And so I guess in having these conversations, in you attending this webinar, it's about how we can all be part of this cultural shift and start extending our lens past the individual, and how we can look at changing spaces and places for our young people. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Claire and Rudy. I think that was really informative and actually demonstrated where Safer London are beginning to travel. I think for people that have looked at the questions in response to Rudy's requests there is our email address around our front door email. So if you want to make a referral, and if you want to make a referral for place, we've got limited capacity, but we are beginning to move along to actually accepting referrals around places Claire shared with us. I'm going to ask my colleagues that are on this webinar to turn their cameras on and their mics on. We've got a couple of really interesting questions here before we wrap up. So I'm going to, in the first instance, I think I'm probably going to ask Claire and Carleen to kick off. I don't know who wants to. There's a question that's been posed here that says, how hard is it getting people to shift from thinking about an antisocial behaviour to more of a contextual safeguarding approach? Are places like shops resistant, or do they get it? So I don't know, Carleen, do you want to kick off, and then Claire, if you've got any observations?
So what I'd say is I think it all depends on the approach that you take, and we have been really surprised by how open a range of partners have been to adopting a contextual safeguarding lens. When it's explained, it kind of makes sense, and I think that's what's leveraged the response. It hasn't been kind of coming in and just getting started. That's why the assessment, I think, has been really important, because businesses have been engaged first through assessments of an area and then invited to discuss the findings of those assessments at a meeting, and through that process come to understand the difference rather than simply being told that it's different. And we've seen that shift for public businesses, but also for community safety partnerships. And we are in conversation with a number of kind of national private companies who operate in public spaces, who are starting to understand the difference. I mean, a clear one would be, a typical response to antisocial behaviour in a fast food outlet would be to switch the internet access off in that outlet to move those young people on. That absolutely would not be a contextual safeguarding intervention. A contextual safeguarding intervention would want to understand why harm was emanating in that locality, and then work alongside young people to ensure that it could be safe for them to spend time in the fast food restaurant, because the fast food restaurant should be safe for them to be in. So we wouldn't want to be moving them on. We'd want them to feel welcome there, and so the Wi-Fi should remain on. So that's not always obvious to people, and we're very much focused on not trying to displace children, but trying to keep them with us as much as possible through collaboration. So it is more through the practicing, I find, that we're seeing a shift in ideas and thinking.
I think that's a really strong observation, Carleen, that it's not about shifting young people around, but it is about making those spaces safe for them. It's an appropriate place for them to be. I think that is. Claire, I'm putting you on the spot, but did you want to add anything? Have you had any experience of pushback so far?
I think sometimes it can depend on your approach. And for me, I think that my approach is always kind of to invite people in. So I really want them to, I acknowledge the fact that they have expertise within this conversation as well. And I suppose if there are things that kind of come up that perhaps I'm like, that I might need to challenge, it's just about reframing that narrative. And I think more often than not, my experience has actually been that people care. On a whole, I think that, sometimes there's, particularly in a big city, that we can sometimes separate ourselves from more of that community mentality. But sitting down and having a conversation with individuals or with teams, that what I see again and again is that people do genuinely care about young people. And then it's actually, I suppose, having a conversation with them about I suppose those avenues for empowerment. So, okay, this is what we see, what can we do to work towards that together? Because I think that we can feel disempowered a lot, and that the issue feels so big, but then it's kind of breaking it down into those little small contributions that we can make as a community.
Oh, thank you. There's another really interesting question here, and I think, sorry, Carleen, I'm not surprised by this, that most of the questions are for you, but is there anywhere that's considered to be a best practice example of contextual safeguarding, and how clearly did the impact show up? So that's a big question.
Yeah, there is no area. There is no area, I wouldn't say. There are lots of examples where we've seen contextual safeguarding in action, but in the areas that we're supporting to develop this approach, we're taking 3 years to get them to a place where they're nearing embedding. So nowhere will have it that's just what they do all the time, and if they say that's what they do, then they probably haven't fully understood it. But a lot of people have an ambition to work towards the framework and can evidence examples of how they have worked towards the framework. So an example of that would be in one of our local authorities, where there were concerns about young people being approached and groomed into drug dealing in and around a library area, and concerns about drug use outside the library, and there are about 80 young people congregating in and around the library after school. They were there because a local fast food restaurant had switched their Wi-Fi off, so that young people wouldn't be in that locality, because there had been similar concerns about that locality. So the young people had moved onto the library to access the internet, and because they were congregating there, they started to be approached again by people who were trying to groom them into exploitation. So the intervention involved an assessment of the library, what was going on there, the creation of a pop-up youth club in the library to work alongside young people to produce some solutions for how to build safety in and around the library, and also to work with them on things like substance misuse education and so on and so forth. And then training to the library staff on bystander intervention and on adolescent development to build up their confidence in forming positive relationships with the young people in the library. And as a result of that work, yes, there were reduced complaints about antisocial behaviour, quite significant reductions, but more importantly, the library became a sustainable, safe space for those young people. Those young people continued to spend time in the library after school and didn't go elsewhere as a result of professional intervention. And when the pop-up youth club disappeared and the social workers went away, the library staff remained confident in their guardianship role and had a positive relationship with those young people, and knew when the appropriate times were to flag concerns. And that was in addition to some individual support for some of those young people around substance use. So that was an effective contextual intervention. It built sustainable safety, built guardianship, targeted the context through the lens of child welfare with the right partners, measures its outcome contextually, and importantly kept children where they were. The local authority that delivered that wouldn't say that they have a fully operational contextual safeguarding system, but they've definitely achieved a contextual safeguarding response to that library, and now reflected on, well, what would it take for that to be business as usual? What would the referral pathway need to look like? How would we chair these meetings, and so on and so forth? And that's why the piloting process is so important for these practices, so that we understand what the approach requires of our system and how we measure the success at a pilot level, so that we can then scale up that measurement across the system.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to ask you one of the first questions that come in that sort of for me is a very interesting one, because I've done so much work around children's social care. But someone poses the question, I'm interested in how children's guardians in care proceedings, who perhaps have a more forensic overview, can ensure they use a contextual safeguarding lens. So, sorry, Carleen, probably for you again. But again, I'm really interested in how we move some of this learning into that arena.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple of things. The first is that in practice, in test sites, we see a lot of individual social workers and other practitioners on our network really engaging in activity that we call context weighting, where they look at all the context around that child, and they try to, alongside the young person, weight the influence of those contexts on that child's safety, their decision making, and so on and so forth. So you could have very high levels of safety within the family home, but the weight of influence of that family home in terms of the sexual exploitation the child's experiencing might be quite reduced. So it's looking at levels of safety protection risk in the varying contexts and the level of influence they currently have, in order to prioritize where does our intervention need to focus. Now, in terms of care proceedings, it's then really important to ask, is this approach that we are taking proceeding against the context and creating safety in the context that is actually attributable to the harm this child is experiencing? And for some, that will be the case. It will be that factors out within the family home are such that they are really creating a push into an extra familial context that's unsafe, and we need to reduce that push as well as deal with the extra familial context. For other families, it will primarily be a pull, and so proceeding through care proceedings with a child in a way that holds parents responsible for a context that's beyond their control is not appropriate and would be challenged. So context weighting can facilitate a more critical examination of decision making throughout the social care pathway in relation to families and the expectations being placed on parents when their children come to harm outside of the family home, but also helps people organize their thoughts a bit to think, how do we target our concerns to the most appropriate context and specifically. We're also partway through a study into the use of out of area placements as a response to extrafamilial harm. We recently conducted a survey of a selection of local areas to understand the rate at which they were using out of area placements, and we did see a real variance there from none in the month of September 2019 to a quarter of all extrafamilial harm cases resulting in an out of area placement in the month of September 2019. So local areas taking a different approach to this, and that not solely being driven by availability of local placements, that is a factor, but a stronger factor being the strategic position taken by the local area as to whether or not this is an intervention that they want to use, and how much they want to use it determines then how much investment they make in local provision, and how much they attempt to build safety in contexts where the child lives so they don't need to be moved away. So kind of a myriad of different factors driving those decisions. And we were at that point asking independent reviewing officers and others that review the plans for children in care to think about whether the plan for them, whether they've been placed at a distance or not, includes a plan to increase safety in the context that drove that placement in the first place. So even if the child has had to be moved, if the ambition is that it is a temporary move, that there is real clarity in how it will be a temporary move, and that clarity is linked to a plan to build safety in the context that the child was moved away from so they can be safely returned. And the plan isn't solely about fixing the child to return more resilient to a context that remains unsafe, because often those children remain in out of area placements until adulthood because there's a persistent sense that they cannot return. And should a child want to, it's a very difficult situation for that young person to be in. So there are different ways in which, for children in care and those who are responsible for them in terms of foster carers, residential units, independent reviewing officers and guardians, all thinking about how they apply a contextual lens to care proceedings, planning and reunification.
Thank you very much. And as you were talking then, it made me think about the applicability of that to some of the work when very often we're involved with young people that are victims of violence and what we need to apply to that. I'm really sorry, we're running out of time now. There are more questions, they're quite specific. We will give people answers. I'd like to thank Claire and Rudy for their input, and Carly as well for her questioning. Carleen in particular, thank you so very, very much for taking up some time to spend with us today. This is the last of our summer webinars. We're about to kick off in the autumn, supporting and working with colleagues from the USA, colleagues from the Cure Violence team, to look at what, if anything, can be learned from the work that they're doing in America to translate here into the UK. So we will still be continuing to do webinars, which I think is going to be a theme for many of us now. But I'd just like to thank everybody for your time. I hope those people that have been listening have found it useful. And I hope you all have a good afternoon and it stops raining and galing very shortly. It's awful where I am, and I'm just very pleased that my Wi-Fi stood up. So thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.